Writing speculative fiction can be a perilous undertaking. Most artists hope that their work endures in the public imagination long after its initial publication, but sometimes that endurance can lead to problems down the road, especially if the work in question becomes part of a long-running series. In this video, we'll look at one example of how Star Trek has encountered this problem, and some of the ways the creators of various Trek projects have dealt with it, as we wrestle with the question, when did Star Trek's Eugenics Wars actually happen? First, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, what the hell are the Eugenics Wars? The Eugenics Wars are first mentioned in the classic Trek episode Space Seed, which introduces Khan. A group of genetically engineered supermen took control of dozens of nations. Eventually, they were overthrown and managed to escape the planet prior to being executed as war criminals. After drifting through space in suspended animation for centuries, they're discovered and revived by the crew of the USS Enterprise, and that didn't go so well. Subsequent mentions of the Eugenics Wars provide a bit more detail. On Enterprise, we learn that Captain Archer's great-grandfather fought in them. We also learn that the genetically engineered supermen were called augments, and we learn casualties of the wars were high, numbering somewhere north of 30 million. As a result of the Eugenics Wars, the people of Earth continue to take a dim view of genetic engineering into the 24th century. The Eugenics Wars are among the most consequential and influential events in Star Trek history. Or so we're told, anyway. Looking back across 50 years of Star Trek TV series and films, they don't come up all that often. They've never been dramatized, and we have little information about them. What I just told you is basically it. Except for one detail. The detail referred to by the title of this video. See, we do know when the Eugenics Wars actually happened. And that's the problem. They happened in the 1990s. In Space Seed, Spock establishes that Khan's reign, during which he controlled over a quarter of the Earth's surface, lasted from 1992 to 1996. Since they apparently coincided with the dictatorships of the augments, it's reasonable to assume that the Eugenics Wars took place during roughly the same period. The thing is, I lived through the 1990s. I came of age in the 1990s. I watched The X-Files and listened to Third Eye Blind in the 1990s. It was my decade. And I don't remember any Eugenics Wars happening in the 1990s. Outside of Bosnia and Rwanda and probably a few other places. So why does that matter? Well, it doesn't really matter. Star Trek is an empire of lies. Thanks for watching, everybody. Okay, it matters because it's fun to think about and talk about. That's why it matters. I mean, what the hell else are we doing here? The interesting thing about the dating of the Eugenics Wars is that so far, Star Trek has never retconned them into taking place some other time, which makes them one of the most obvious points where Star Trek's fictional history and the real history of Earth don't agree. And that's of particular interest to me as a Star Trek aficionado, because Star Trek has a long-standing habit of incorporating our world's actual history into its world's fictional history. My favorite example of this is the inclusion into Star Trek canon of the Space Shuttle Enterprise. I'm sure most of you know at least part of that story, but just in case some of you don't, in the mid-1970s, NASA was gearing up the Space Shuttle program, and they announced that they were building the first test shuttle. Star Trek fans wrote to NASA asking them to name the first space shuttle after the USS Enterprise. According to a memo sent to President Gerald Ford by one of his senior advisors, NASA received hundreds of thousands of letters from Trekkies pushing for the shuttle to be named Enterprise. So Ford went for it. And when the first space shuttle was rolled out, it bore the name Enterprise. Gene Roddenberry and the cast of Star Trek, everybody but Shatner, were on hand for the unveiling. And here's a detail that isn't usually included when Star Trek fans talk about the Space Shuttle Enterprise. The original name for that shuttle was the Constitution. And the unveiling was on September 17th, Constitution Day. So Star Trek fans were able to successfully pressure the United States government to name the first space shuttle after their favorite imaginary starship instead of the U.S. Constitution. In 1976, no less, the year the country celebrated its bicentennial. Not the bicentennial of the Constitution, since it wasn't drafted until after the Revolution, but still, that's an all-time boss move. I'm not usually an us versus them sort of guy when it comes to fandom, but beat that, Star Wars fans! Get back to me when you convince NASA to name something after the Millennium Falcon. Anyway, the Space Shuttle Enterprise was incorporated into Star Trek canon pretty much immediately. An image of it is visible on display on the recreation deck of the Enterprise in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Later, in the TV series Enterprise, a sketch of the shuttle is seen hanging in Captain Archer's ready room, and footage of the Space Shuttle Enterprise being rolled out is also part of that show's opening credits montage. We also see a model of a space shuttle, presumably the Enterprise, in Admiral Marcus's office in Star Trek Into Darkness. So a space shuttle that was named Enterprise because of Star Trek is now an official part of Star Trek canon. And sure, you can reconcile that by saying, well, in the Star Trek universe, the shuttle was named Enterprise because of the proud naval lineage of ships with that name, which is something that was actually mentioned in the memos to President Ford as an additional justification for giving the space shuttle that name. But to me, it's a lot more fun to treat it like the inside joke that it is and leave this world-breaking anachronism right there in the middle of Star Trek's in-universe timeline. Just as the Space Shuttle Enterprise became part of Star Trek canon, so too has the rest of actual history as it has transpired. Whenever characters from Star Trek travel back in time and find themselves in the present day, it's always our present day. When Kirk and crew arrive in San Francisco circa 1986, it's not an alternate version of 1986 extrapolated from the Star Trek version of 1968 we glimpsed during the original series. It's a representation of the same 1986 the people sitting in theaters watching the movie we're living in. And that's the whole point. When the crew of the Starship Voyager travels to Los Angeles circa 1996 in the two-part episode Future's End, it seems pretty clear that it's meant to be our Los Angeles. And oh hey, would you look at that? Things seem pretty normal despite the devastating eugenics wars that were raging at around this same time, huh? Obviously, when Space Seed was produced in the 1960s, the 1990s were still way in the future, so it made sense to set the eugenics wars during that time period. The producers of Star Trek were making TV for the people watching then, not for people watching 50 years in the future. Nobody expected anybody to still be paying attention to this shit in 2019. But lucky for us, Star Trek grew into a decades-spanning franchise. A franchise with an in-universe history where the eugenics wars still took place during the 1990s and where Los Angeles looks like this around the same time. Isn't speculative fiction fun? I'm still not over the fact that the year 2001 looked like this instead of this. Could have made a 9/11 reference there. Didn't do it. Not how I roll. I've got a little thing called class. Make a note of that. Write down how classy I am. Anyway, according to Star Trek canon, as far as I can tell, both of these things are true. The eugenics wars happened from roughly 1992 to 1996, and Los Angeles in 1996 was apparently totally unaffected by them. None of the 20th century characters encountered by the Voyager crew mentions the eugenics wars, and none of the Voyager crew expresses any concern about the wars posing a threat to them when they beam down to the planet. So, what gives? How do we reconcile these two things? For the purposes of Future's End, it's relatively simple. We just assume the fighting in the eugenics wars took place outside the United States. According to Spock, Khan's territory was located in Asia and the Middle East. If we assume the countries controlled by the other augments were also outside the Western Hemisphere, it's entirely plausible that the US would remain untouched by the conflict. Remember, World War II was the most devastating war in human history, raged on for years across Europe, Africa, and Asia, resulted in over 80 million total deaths, and the mainland United States emerged virtually without a scratch. The US did suffer over 400,000 military deaths and about 12,000 civilian deaths from various causes related to the war, but it would have been entirely possible to walk through any major American city during the height of the war and see little or no direct evidence of it. If we expand beyond the immediate setting of Future's End and assume that the 1996 the Voyager crew visits was the same as the real 1996 everywhere else besides Los Angeles, finding room for the eugenics wars becomes a lot trickier. We didn't exactly have world peace during the 1990s. There were regional conflicts, acts of terrorism, plenty of horrific violence, but a global war killing 30 million people? Thankfully, no. I mean, unless we all just missed it. Which is possible. I mean, I watched a lot of TV in the 90s, you all, and wasn't none of it the nightly news. You know what I'm saying? The "it happened but nobody noticed" angle was adopted by author Greg Cox for his series of novels chronicling the eugenics wars. With the intention of reconciling the wars as described in Space Seed with actual history, Cox presents Khan's dictatorship as more of a behind-the-scenes shadow government kind of thing. In Cox's version, Khan is not officially in charge of anything, but through a vast secret conspiracy, it was Khan who held the real power. And the wars themselves were similarly clandestine, fought without the knowledge of the general public. The millions of casualties attributed to civil unrest, terrorist attacks, or natural disasters. In Cox's novel, the 1993 Latur earthquake, which killed nearly 10,000 people in southwestern India, was triggered as part of an assassination attempt against Khan by one of his augment rivals. Those of you who were personally affected by the Latur quake might find that in bad taste, but in general, Cox's story is a clever attempt to fit the eugenics wars into actual history. The eugenics wars novels aren't considered official Star Trek canon, but they don't contradict canon in any major ways. So if you're struggling to reconcile the eugenics wars with the rest of history, you might find it useful to add them to your headcanon. One of the most appealing aspects of Star Trek is the way it positions itself as our future. It doesn't take place in some alternate timeline, except when it does. It takes place in our timeline, just a few hundred years down the road. Of course, the longer Star Trek endures, the more of its fictional history our real world will catch up to, and we'll have more opportunities like this to try and smush the two together in a way that makes some kind of sense. There's a big one coming up in about 5 years. One of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine is the two-parter Past Tense, which has Sisko, Bashir, and Dax accidentally thrown back in time to San Francisco circa 2024. Hopefully, fingers crossed, the real 2024 won't include crowded ghettos where homeless and unemployed people are forced to live, walled off from the rest of their cities, so we Trekkies will have to figure out a way to explain that when the time comes. Here's my preferred explanation, and it can apply to the eugenics wars too. Maybe when our real history diverges from Star Trek, it's because we've somehow managed to change things for the better. The version seen or referred to in Star Trek is the first draft, and the version we lived is the revised version, where we managed to correct a few of the mistakes that were made the last time around. While Star Trek's vision of humanity's future is mostly very bright, at least by the time we get to the 22nd and 23rd centuries, its version of our present is often pretty bleak. If our actual present turns out better than the one we're shown in Star Trek, maybe it means we're doing something right. Okay, I didn't say we're doing everything right. Obviously, we're still capable of screwing up in really big, horrible ways that threaten our chances of reaching a Star Trek future, or any future, but at least we avoided the eugenics wars. So far. Nothing like ending on a downer! Hey folks, well that's it for the Eugenics Wars video. Hope you enjoyed that one. I'm going to let you know what the topic of the next Regulation Trek Actually video is going to be in just a minute, but first I've got some shout outs to give for some of my newest Patreon patrons, and their names are Sean Stubblefield, thank you Sean. I Think I'm Nuts, thank you I Think I'm Nuts. Aldrin and Nate Thorne, thank you Aldrin and Nate. Simon Halfdan Vilshaj Garnero, thank you Simon. Michelle Jacobson, thank you Michelle. McBeard, thank you, McBeard. Mike Milleron, thank you, Mike. Thomas Dumbleton, thank you, Thomas. Oystein Royce, thank you, Oystein. The Old Bat, thank you, The Old Bat. Bad Wolf 97, thank you, Bad Wolf 97. Nicholas Lawler, thank you, Nicholas. Philip M. Kava, thank you, Philip. Marai Ziller, thank you, Marai. Lucas Moody, thank you, Lucas. Wolf Avatar, thank you, Wolf Avatar. JV, thank you, Jay. Jeffrey Oliver, thank you, Jeffrey. And Carlisle the Cinephile, thank you, Carlisle. Thanks to everybody whose name I just read. Those fine folks were my newest patrons to pledge $5 a month or more. Now you can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives and become a supporter of this channel for as little as $1 a month. But for $5 a month, you get a shout out at the end of Trek Actually. Now, as long as I'm talking about the Patreon page, for any pledge from $1 on up to however much you can afford and you think I'm worth, all patrons get to vote in the polls that choose future Trek Actually topics. So that's something to think about if you really dig the Star Trek themed stuff that I do. And speaking of those of you who love the Star Trek stuff, which I assume means most of you watching because you're still here, if you like the Star Trek YouTube videos I make, you should also be listening to the Ensign's Log, which is the Star Trek themed improv comedy podcast that I co-host along with the brilliant and hilarious Jason Harding, where Jason and I portray characters. We play low-ranking officers serving aboard a certain legendary Federation starship as it embarks on a certain historic 5-year mission. I think you get where I'm going with this. We've been doing the Ensign's Log for a couple of years now. Each one of our episodes coincides with an episode of classic Star Trek, and we are closing in on the end of our 2nd season. We'll be there before you know it and before we know it. We have had so much fun doing this show, and I am so gratified to those of you who have been listening and have been enjoying it and sharing your love of it with me and Jason. We really, really appreciate that. If you like the Star Trek stuff that I do on this YouTube channel and you haven't checked out the Ensign's Log, it is linked in the description below. Check out the Ensign's Log. Listen on the website, listen on SoundCloud, subscribe via RSS, and listen using your favorite podcast app, but check out the Ensign's Log. I think you will really, really dig it if you like the Star Trek themed stuff. Now then, speaking of Star Trek themed content on this channel, the next regulation episode of Trek Actually, the November edition, as decided by a poll of my Patreon patrons, will be on the subject, Star Trek doesn't actually understand evolution. Those of you who are not only Star Trek fans, but are also science nerds, and I think there's probably quite a bit of crossover there, may know this already, but quite often when Star Trek touches on the subject of evolution, I'm talking about biological evolution, Darwinian evolution, they don't really get it right. They depict it in ways that aren't really accurate or factual, that are maybe a little misleading if you don't really know how evolution works scientifically speaking. So we're going to take a look at some of the times that evolution has been a plot point in Star Trek episodes, that Star Trek episodes have hinged on some bit of evolutionary theory, and how they've kind of screwed it up. They've gotten it wrong. There are quite a few instances of that, especially in the Next Generation era, unfortunately, the most popular era of Star Trek, and it's the era where they really, really screwed up their presentation of and their depiction of evolution. So we're going to look at some of those instances, how it got it wrong, how maybe it could have gotten it right. Hopefully it'll be informative and a lot of fun. I love talking about evolution, and I love talking about Star Trek even more, so I'm really looking forward to that one. So I hope you enjoy that video when it comes out next month. I hope you enjoyed this one. I thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.